Thank you very much. Good morning. I am so delighted to be with you all this morning. Thank you for giving up yoga to come and have breakfast. We have some great friends and a wealth of expertise in the room. They asked me to be inspirational, and I said, what else you got? Because it is, that's a big challenge. But I thought you're going to have so many talks today. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes, and then I hope we can turn it into a conversation. I wanted to start the day with is thinking about how do we build bridges and bring people together in a world that feels increasingly fractious and divided and polarized. And increasingly, my observation, and something I worry deeply about, is that the greatest divide in our world these days is not racial or ethnic or religious, it's socioeconomic. And we're becoming socioeconomically segregated in ways that are have terrible long-term impacts on everyone. And I think the idea that we can just concentrate poverty in one place and ignore that, we know now to be false. And the goal of this conference, to promote equity and opportunities for all, is so closely aligned with the mission and values of Habitat for Humanity. Habitat's mission statement, if you didn't know, is that we bring people together to build homes, communities, and hope. And the last ad when we were doing that was hope. And I think that intangible, though, is such an important one because we know that if people don't have any kind of vision or see any potential for a better future, then it's much harder for them to put the efforts in. Habitat is committed to building human and financial capital to help create an economy that works for everyone. It is, our family has decided as a formal discipline to take a fast from TV news because we find it too deeply disappointing. But I find it's hard not to be bombarded every day with messages about difference or indifference, about entitlement and responsibility, and about those who belong and those who are or should be excluded, depending who you're listening to. Sometimes those messages result in actions that are taken to extremes with heartbreaking results. I want to share a quote I love from a poem by Edwin Markham. He wrote, "He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and drew him in." I want to share three brief stories that capture both what really made me fall in love with Habitat, but more the spirit, I think, of what this conference is all about. First one is one that gets replicated all over the place, but some of my favorite stories are surprises. And my goddaughter was visiting us last year in Atlanta, and we were thrilled to have her. And she said, I have one friend in Atlanta. Would it be okay to invite her over? And we said, of course, we'd love to meet your friend. And so Crystal came over, and the two of them in Virginia had gone through sign language school together. And Crystal is a remarkable young woman, and she had gone through sign language so she could do interpretation for counselors with hearing impaired at-risk youth. And then she had the idea, you know what, I could cut out the middleman. So she, after putting herself through college, has put herself through, while working full-time, a master's degree in counseling. And she's taking a pause, and when she earns enough, she's going to go back and get her doctorate so she can provide these services directly. And I was so inspired by this. And I always want to hear people's stories. Crystal, what was the spark? What made you want to serve in this way and make a difference? And she paused, and she didn't know what I did, but she said, things were actually really hard for me when I was a child. And I won't go into all the details, but her mom literally at one point had to just escape in the middle of the night with Crystal and her 4 siblings. And they ended up homeless, and then they ended up just bouncing around from place to place. And instability is such a tax on children's ability to study, ability to succeed. She said, but everything changed for me when I was 13, and my mom qualified to build a Habitat for Humanity house. And all 5 kids are either in college or out of college, and they're going to make our world a much better place. But they had the chance, and just how many more crystals are there all over this country and world who could be world changers if we just unleash them and give them the opportunity to grow into all that God intended. Second story. One of my favorites is, as many of you know, President Carter is our most famous volunteer, and every year he goes somewhere in the world and builds. And the first time I had the chance to do that was 12 years ago in Lonavala, India, where his mom, at the age of 70, had gone to serve in the Peace Corps. So small rural community, a couple hours outside Mumbai, and we have thousands of people from all over the world coming together, and we're building these very small duplexes with families. And I think we had 21 countries represented, and I think most wonderfully, we had these Indian Brahmins who, the idea of being out in the sun doing manual labor and laying block was a very foreign concept. And everyone was just having a wonderful experience. And then the wonderful thing, how many of you have ever been on a Habitat build? So never one. Wow, awesome. So if you've ever been to a dedication, that's the emotional highlight. And at the dedication, we were building these little duplexes, so we had two families at each dedication. And I'll never forget our one homeowner, his name was Aziz, stood up and he put his arm around his new neighbor who was sharing a common wall, whose name was Subhash. And he said, we're from different faiths, one Muslim, one Hindu, which is a big social barrier in India. And he said, and we're from different castes, which in rural India is an even more substantial social barrier. But he said, now we're brothers. And this process of coming together and putting in their sweat equity and working together over the months before the build and then in that process had bonded them together. And I was able to do an interview with them 10 years later, and the families are just thriving. The community is doing great. And it's really an example of a truly interfaith and blended community in multiple ways. And I think those glimmers of what we can do when we set aside difference just lift me up. The third is a very intentional strategy. And Habitat's primary mission, obviously, is housing. But the way we build often is able to reduce barriers. And so we do a lot of interfaith work across the United States. And one particular program we call Abraham Builds. And that's really bringing the three monotheistic faiths together to focus on what they have in common as opposed to what separates them. And so we have synagogues, mosques, and churches come together to build houses as an expression of their common values. And we're doing that in communities all over the country. And wanted to just share some quotes from this particular one was in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is from Sophia Khan, who is a Muslim community rep for the Abraham Project there. She said, I love the project and have built deep relationships with all the team members. We visit each other's place of worship and attended other faith-based activities while working with Habitat Kansas City. Despite what's happening over the world, our interfaith team has shown the community how to love and respect each other and to focus on our similarities. I think we need a whole lot more of that in the misunderstandings in our world. And this year, as so many of you know, is a momentous year. It's the 50th anniversary of, sadly, Martin Luther King's death. It's also the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, which we have not fulfilled so far. But it's really important. As we were reflecting on that, we were thinking about how to celebrate it. And Habitat created a partnership with the King Center. And so we're doing beloved community builds all across the United States all year long to commemorate that and to bring attention back to the Fair Housing Act and the original commitments that came with that, but very much with the spirit of how do we bridge and cross lines. And we've asked people all over the country and all over the world to take a pledge, and I'd like to share that pledge with you. I believe that every single one of us, regardless of who we are or where we come from, deserves a decent life. Like Dr. King, I believe in a beloved community of justice, equal opportunity, and love of my fellow human beings. I want to help build a world that leaves no room for poverty, prejudice, or violence. I pledge to work together with my neighbors, side by side, to create strength, stability, and self-reliance for all. I ask others to join me. It's up to us to make this a reality. My request of all of you is, would you take that pledge and keep the vision of a beloved community before you, during this event? I think, and I wasn't able to be there last night, but the themes of this week are so deeply well aligned with that, of how do we create financial empowerment, how do we create opportunity so that every child in our country has the opportunity to grow and has that chance. I think the American dream was always premised on the idea that if you played by the rules, worked hard, did your share, that you could succeed. And I think that is still true, can be true, but hasn't always been true for some parts of our society. And I hope you'll join me in an extraordinary vision of what we could do together so that someday what we're talking about today will seem common and actually ordinary, because that's how it's supposed to be. I'm going to stop here and hope we can turn it into a conversation, because there's great wisdom and energy in this room, and you don't want to hear me talking for a long time. So I would welcome comments, questions, responses, and I think we have a few minutes before we can close. Thank you. It is... Yes, ma'am. That's right.
So you have a lot of single moms who need housing.
I do.
So how do you compensate for that, or how much
Yep.
do you expect of women who are? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Susan Johnson Cook. So a lot of people are single moms who come
Yep.
looking for home or needing homes. So how do you compensate for that? If they're a mother by themselves and they need a home and they need hope.
Yeah, thank you. I never take for granted, and I'll be speaking later this morning, that one of the great misconceptions of Habitat is that we give away the houses, and Ambassador Susan is exactly right. It's a pretty tough process. The families that buy our homes put a lot of effort in, and what we call, because it's so hard to raise a down payment if you're low income, and we primarily target 30 to 60% of area median income families. And so instead of a down payment, they put in what we call sweat equity, hundreds of hours of helping build their homes and their neighbors' homes. And then they have to take classes in financial literacy and home maintenance so that they're well prepared by the time they close. So the answer is, it's really tough. We will work with them, but we don't waive the requirement. And because a huge number of low-income families are often women-headed households, the practical reality is now we'll let sometimes their children can help, their relatives can help, their friends can help. So we'll try to work with them, because we know how hard it is to work full-time and do this. But we also find that process is actually really important to why our homeowners have been so successful. And so we actually don't want to shortcut that process, even if it means it can take a while for them to get through, because they're building community in that process. They're building skills and capability and confidence. And all of which have helped, even though we are a subprime lender, remarkably low foreclosure rates, because families are well prepared by the time they close. Thank you. It's a great question.
I have a question for you. So, question around, the report came out a few years ago stating that Atlanta is number 2 in the country for income and economic inequality. You look at all of the development taking place in the city, and in a lot of ways has pushed, let's just say, the poor further out into the suburbs, where there's some transportation challenges and other challenges that don't really support the family. So when you look at the development that Habitat is doing, let's say in the city of Atlanta, how are you engaging with your corporate partners to address some of the challenges where investors are coming in behind Habitat when they identify neighborhoods where you're looking to do builds?
Thank you. It's, boy, a monster question. That's one of the great challenges for all our cities. We were actually just talking about it at our table this morning. First, I think you're referring to the inequality data, big study from Stanford and Harvard that came out from Raj Chetty and others a few years ago. And I think the big insight I took away from the data is not that we don't have economic mobility, but it's bifurcated. So we've got low-income families that are in mixed-income communities actually have quite high economic mobility, but low-income children who grow up in concentrated poverty have almost no economic mobility. And I'm going to be up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which unfortunately is number one in the not-too-distant future, meeting with a group there thinking about how could you change the model, because I think in Atlanta we've seen it. And the old model of saying if we could just concentrate all the low-income folks in one area, that's good, that's okay, hasn't worked for anybody. And I think the hard part is the best answer is mixed-income, mixed-use communities where people can live close to where they work, so we don't have everybody driving to a different part of town, which is bad for everybody. And also, so mixed income communities tend to drive better schools, tend to drive economic development, tend to drive. And I think the great dilemma, I don't know how many of you are Atlantans, there's a huge project right now that many people in the room are involved in on the west side of Atlanta. And we need a better word. Gentrification has gotten loaded. And with some validity, but we need economic development. We want better conditions. We want better schools. We want better living environments for everybody in our city. And how do you do that in an inclusive way? And I think that's the great dilemma. And to the specific part, I think the hardest single thing is what do you do with absentee investors who are holding properties but not improving them? And it's a really tough one. And that's, I think, ultimately where I've seen success, it has to be coalition-based. And our experience of neighborhood revitalization, which we're part of, we started or joined coalitions in about 300 cities around the country to do neighborhood revitalization. And what we've learned is first it has to start with the voice of the community, that you can't impose a solution from the outside. But second, then it really does take a multi-sector approach. We need the public sector because they control land use, they control enforcement, they control law enforcement. It takes the private sector because the nonprofits can't build at scale the way the private sector can. We need the banks and financial institutions, and we do need the nonprofits because they often represent voice and the community cohesion piece. And you've really got to get, as hard and messy and slow as that is, if you don't really get all those voices together, it's really hard to do complex community development. And I think our collective challenge is to do that in an inclusive way that gets the benefits of economic development, but in a way that doesn't displace or force people out. And I think the current model where we were sharing, I mean, the true extreme is San Francisco, where now the median one-bedroom apartment is about $3,500. So how does that work? And so ultimately, do you have I remember I was talking to a construction worker there a couple months ago. He's driving 2 hours in, and then he and a bunch of guys, they crash in a hotel 4 nights a week with 6 of them in a room, and then they go back home 2 hours. That's terrible for their families. That's not sustainable. The roads are getting worse and worse, so that commute's getting longer and longer. But long term, we can't have a society that only wealthy people live together, and all of our service workers and other parts of the community don't get to be there. And so I think these are hard questions that we've got to grapple with together. In the back? Oh, sorry. We've got the mic, and then we'll go to the back. Sir.
I don't know. Okay. I noticed that the incarceration rate is very high in the United States, and one of the things that is very hard that the people who come out from incarceration is housing, and they kind of locked out. I wonder, do y'all address that issue or have?
It's a great question. The short answer is we're further down the housing continuum often because similar thing for someone who's recently arrived in the country. Ultimately, they can be a wonderful candidate to buy a Habitat house, but usually they've got to get stable and get enough income, and so it's going to be rental for a period of time. So if we support from an advocacy perspective the whole continuum of housing solutions, but our particular niche is affordable home ownership. So we have done, I would say, different kinds of programs around skills, so to help on the income side. but we don't do rental housing, which takes us out of direct solutions. But I do think it's a huge issue that if we want to get rid of recidivism, I mean, so many things, if we don't start with housing, we don't get all the other pieces. Housing's not the only need, but in so many ways, it's foundational. If you don't have stable housing, it's really tough to get the health or the educational or the income that you need to be self-sustaining. And so I think that's one piece of our big challenge. Thank you.
My name is Melanie Avery, and I work with a nonprofit for veterans and veteran families. We provide housing and holistic services, and some of our veterans actually have enough income to own housing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges that we find is getting enough support for the sweat equity so that they can actually get over the hump, because they've been applying to Habitat and other groups. I'm wondering about whether or not, like in the rental affordable housing market, we look at like programs with program-based vouchers for those who are going to rent. Do you look at a similar model in terms of ownership? Like, are you building buildings where people of a similar background can live together through the home ownership model?
That's historically we have been a rural, peri-urban, or I would call low-density urban model. So we have primarily built single-family homes. Now, as land gets more and more expensive, more and more of our affiliates are building either zero lot line townhome, or in places like New York and San Francisco, it has to be condominium because the land is just so staggeringly expensive. We do a lot with veterans, and we find obviously it's a area of need, and often they do have different kinds of support. If they're disabled, we're very flexible in terms of letting friends and family support the sweat equity, and often they can work in our restores or do things that don't require direct manual labor if they're not able to do that. And we find in general, it's been really interesting. For veterans, it's not just providing housing, but we've often found that returning veterans from the war, in a way, coming out and serving, they're so service-minded, can help them in the transition process of reacclimating, because the reverse culture shock of coming out of the war zone back into the U.S. is so dislocating and so challenging, as you know. So what we found is we try to partner. We have done things where we'll help with the construction or the rehab or the support of supportive housing or other specialized housing. We just don't operate it because it's not our skill set, and there are other people who do that better than we do. So we want to be a good partner, but again, we feel like no one else is doing kind of our niche, and so we want to keep working on the home ownership piece, because we see such value both to communities as well as to the families to have some percentage of home ownership in low-income communities. But that's a particular group we care deeply about and are trying to find ways to be helpful.
Mo Cantrell from Denver, Colorado. The question I have is kind of maybe outside of your expertise a little bit, but I'm just curious. You talked about your target market for Habitat for Humanity homes. Can you talk a little bit about the marketing that you guys do to get in front of that audience?
Yeah, thank you. We are federated, so if you don't know, that is both beautiful and complicated. So we do our work through 1,300 local Habitat affiliates or chapters all across the U.S., and then we're in 70 countries. And so the principles are the same. The context and the way we work, it varies quite a lot from community to community. But typically the marketing is done very much through local community outreach. And I think what we've had to get better at is reflecting that different communities have evolved. We have to be more creative about marketing. So are we marketing in multiple languages? Are we marketing to the different cultural groups? Are we getting the word out? Because it is, what I'm seeing a couple trends is there's such a massive need. I'm finding families are needing longer to get prepared, that often it takes a little bit longer to clean up their credit and get in that pipeline, and that's something we're very much aligned with Operation Hope on. And that sadly, in way too many places, we have massive waiting lists because the supply of land is so thin compared to the demand for our services. So most of the time, marketing isn't the challenge. When it is a challenge, usually it's because that local affiliate hasn't thought about how to more creatively do outreach to some of the less served communities, particularly of other cultures or or where English is not their first language. But I wish we get to the point where no one needs our service anymore, then we'll take on another challenge.
Jonathan, I want to thank you for being with us this
It's a
morning.
pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I'd just like to close, and regardless of your faith or lack of faith, this is, I want to just end as we go into a couple days of really important meetings with my favorite blessing. This actually comes from the Franciscan tradition. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may wish for justice, freedom, and peace. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so you can do what others say cannot be done. Thank you. Have a great day.